the current mainstream version of Roman history and chronology is absolutely insane and completely wrong. Roman history, in the way that the mainstream records it, is absolutely bonkers. In fact, I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of you out there, that when you very first learned about how the mainstream has laid out Roman chronology, you are probably thinking something like, what the hell are these people talking about? What the hell is going on here? How are you getting that kind of a timeline out of the evidence that you are currently presenting? I mean, what the hell is going on? So if you felt lost when you very first learned about the chronology of Rome, don't feel stupid, because you're not stupid. What that feeling actually was is what we call common sense. You know, that skill that no longer exists in Western society? Yeah, common sense. But when you first heard about the chronology of the Roman Empire, I guarantee you felt something weird about what you were being taught. And the reason why you felt something weird when they were teaching you about Roman chronology is because Roman chronology objectively makes no sense. We actually have some pretty serious problems with the way that people are taught history in the modern age. I mean, obviously, this whole channel is dedicated to it, and there are countless other channels nowadays that do the same stuff. However, the one thing that the vast majority of other channels do not do is they do not challenge the chronology, which is weird because those same channels will say stuff like, yeah, they believe in science and they're following the evidence. But when it comes to the evidence that completely disproves all of mainstream chronology, suddenly everybody shuts up. And it's funny too, because we go to a lot of these scholars looking for good information, and they actually do have a lot of good information. But the one area that I find that almost every single historical researcher fails on is understanding real chronology. And I'm not just referencing mainstream historians. I'm talking about alternative historians as well. The vast majority of people refuse to acknowledge that there are problems with established chronology. So, for example, when we look at Rome, one of the things that you'll find is that even alternative researchers will immediately still latch on to all of the dates that the mainstream gives for all of these events that happened during the Roman periods, and they do not question any of them. It's a very weird dichotomy that I find in the community. So we're going to talk about it right now, and we're going to try to break down some of these walls, because if we continue to hold modern mainstream chronology as the status quo, it will be impossible for us to make any actual headway when it comes to understanding real history. Now, the Roman Empire situation is a huge problem because there's a lot of world history that is calibrated based on Roman chronology. And of course, even funnier, Roman chronology can also be calibrated on Egyptian chronology, and of course, Egyptian chronology is 100% fake and wrong. I mean, there is literally, I don't think there is probably a single real date in the modern chronology when it comes to Egypt. So if we find a situation to where Roman chronology is being calibrated on Egyptian chronology, I mean, how messed up do you think we're getting? And of course, it gets even worse because you'll find Egyptian chronology being calibrated off of Roman chronology as well. And then, of course, it gets even crazier when you factor in Greek chronology, and people try to use Greek chronology to calibrate Egyptian chronology, and then they try to use Egyptian chronology to calibrate the Roman chronology, and then they'll use Roman chronology to attempt to calibrate Greek chronology. Are you seeing the problem with the way mainstream operates when it comes to chronology? That circular logic that I just went through with respect to how chronology is calibrated is the legit way that mainstream historians calibrate chronology. I mean, that's what they do. They literally use circular logic to come up with their dates. And then, of course, right now, I get it. The mainstream person can start yelling at me saying, oh, but what about radiocarbon dating? And what about dendrochronology? And what about numismatics? And blah, 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 blah. It's the same problem. All of these dating methods that we have, it doesn't matter the dating method, by the way. It doesn't matter if we're dating things off of calibrations from civilizations, like I just mentioned, or we are attempting to use a scientific methodology like radiocarbon dating. All of the problems boil down to the same issue: calibration. How are historians, how are radiocarbon daters, how are dendrochronologists calibrating their dates? How are they coming up with this whole chronology, with this whole detailed chronology about events that took place within the past, let's just say, 3,000 years? I'll just round it up. The past 3,000 years. How are they calibrating this? Like, how do they know what events took place when, so that they can calibrate the dates that they give us and make sure that they are correct? They do not have a real scientific method to do this. For example, and I won't belabor the point, this is a whole other show in and of itself. I want to get into destroying the Roman chronology really quick, eventually. But, for example, if you look at radiocarbon dating, I always see and hear people say, well, the radiocarbon date says this. Trust the science, bigot. I mean, that is literally what most people have as a mentality. Just trust the science. It's scientific. Radiocarbon dating, oh, it sounds so scientific. It must be precise. The vast majority of people have no idea that there is a calibration issue with that, right? And that's because common sense is gone. Nobody actually goes out of their way anymore to question the radiocarbon dating methodology, because everybody is so used to seeing, people with tremendous amount of power in academia relying on this kind of a science. And then, of course, if we factor in the modern day religion of scientism, then we have a situation to where your average person, even though your average person is a decent intellectual person, no longer knows how to question something that is now titled science. So, for example, radiocarbon dating is now not questioned by the vast majority of people because the vast majority of people believe in the religion of scientism, and you are not allowed to question the science, which is one of the stupidest, unscientific things you can ever do in your life. You question the science for the rest of your life. That is almost the textbook definition of science. We question everything forever. It never stops. So when we have professors or archaeologists or historians or whoever coming to us with radiocarbon dates, the first thing you need to do is you need to question those dates. So really quick, why am I calling into question radiocarbon dating? Here's why. Because radiocarbon dating had to be calibrated off of something. Right? So just because we can say, well, I mean, this decay rate was 1,500 years ago. Okay, so what? What does that mean? If you do not know what was happening 1,500 years ago, then you cannot place a particular artifact in that period of time. So what does a radiocarbon dater do? They go to the historians and they ask the historian, hey, what does this artifact look like to you? What period of time do you think this was in? And then, of course, the historian will give them a date. Now, here's the problem. Where did that historian get that date from? Well, the historian's going to say something, well, I went over and I read it in Tacitus, and Tacitus said that this would be from around this period of time, and we think it's that period of time, so I told the radiocarbon dater that period of time, and that means that the result from the radiocarbon dating will now be of that period in time. If you are citing Tacitus for anything, you are scientifically stupid, right? We now know for a fact that Tacitus is forged. We now know for a fact that Tacitus's work are dubious at best, right? So we have radiocarbon daters calibrating from historians who are calibrating themselves off of dubious works. This is how the chronology has been built up, and nobody questions it, or at least the vast majority of people do not. So when we have alternative researchers trying to piece together real history, for example, you guys out there trying to figure out Atlantis, for example, what you guys are doing, I'm not going to say you guys, what those people are doing is those people are still adhering to established mainstream chronology to build up their own alternative chronology to fit Atlantis in. For example, if the mainstream chronology is wrong, that means your Atlantis chronology will also be heavily affected, to say the least. This is why it is important for us to look at the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire is key to so much of the mainstream chronology and understanding of general history, that if any of this stuff is wrong, any of these dates are wrong, any of these, names are wrong, any of these events are wrong, that means that anything that relies on those events to calibrate other aspects of history are also wrong as well. So, for example, let me give you one other example, I guess, just to put this into perspective. For those of you out there trying to figure out when the pyramids were built, for example, we find a situation to where some of Egyptian chronology is also calibrated off of Roman chronology. So if Roman chronology is wrong and those calibrations are incorrect, that means whatever theory you might have for the date of the building of the pyramids will also be wrong. You cannot use mainstream chronology. And I do not expect you to just take my word for it. Even though at this point in time, you should be heavily questioning it just off of everything I've said so far. That should have been enough. But you know what? Here, let's go ahead and provide a ton of evidence that conclusively proves that mainstream Roman chronology is wrong. So, I have made a claim. Roman chronology, as the mainstream currently holds, is completely wrong. And I don't just mean, a little wrong. I don't just mean they have a few dates that are kind of off. It is 100% wrong. Wrong to the point to where we actually have upwards of 800 to 1,000 extra years that have been added to the Roman chronology. That's right, I literally just told you that there might be upwards of a millennium of history that literally never existed, but is being taught right now to everybody on this planet. And it's being believed. And that means if I'm giving you a potential millennium of BS that exists within that chronology, that means you have almost a millennium of bad calibration as well, affecting every other aspect of world history. Yeah, this is a problem. This is a huge issue. And it's one of the reasons why history makes no sense. Like I said at the beginning of this show, I guarantee you, most people, when they first hear the basic outline of the Roman Empire chronology, it just doesn't make sense. This is why people will fail their tests, because logically speaking, using your common sense, it doesn't work. The way the chronology is built up in the mainstream, immediately, you at least subconsciously immediately know something is wrong. However, since we are not taught to question whatever the teacher or the professor is talking about, we inevitably are forced to sit there and memorize whatever garbage they're spieling, right? That's all we can do. You're not allowed to say, hey, wait a second, professor. Why the hell would the Roman Empire move from the west to the east? I mean, how do you even do that logistically, right? I mean, that's one of these problems that pops up, with moving over to the Byzantium portion of the Roman Empire, quote unquote. There's all these just weird oddities that don't make any sense, but from the professor's point of view, you're not allowed to ask those questions, and they have some ready-made garbage answers to kind of shoo you away anyways, to just discard any of your curiosities. So, okay, I know, I'm just going to start pissing myself off. All right, let's get into the evidence. Let's go over all the stuff that is wrong. Not all of it. We'll just do the basics. We're going to go over the basics of what the Roman Empire is relative to how the mainstream sees it. And then let's destroy all of that so that we can understand that we need to completely rewrite all of chronology in that Mediterranean North African area, because if we don't, then world history is never going to make sense. too much of it relies on Roman chronology as a foundation for what the mainstream believes happened in our past. And if we continue to rely on it, then nothing's going to make sense. Okay. So let's go over what the mainstream generally believes. Let's see what they think happened with Rome, and then we'll destroy it all and go from there. Right now, mainstream has essentially 3 Roman empires, which is already a little weird because you could easily argue that there would be, I don't know, maybe kind of 5 empires with respect to mainstream chronology. But, I digress. This is their garbage. So essentially, there are 3 Roman empires that are generally acknowledged with respect to mainstream. The first empire we have is called the Roman Empire, and this empire existed according to mainstream. Remember, these dates are mainstream chronology, not real chronology. They say that the first Roman Empire existed between 27 BC all the way until 476 AD, and this would be in the western part of Rome. And I have to be specific with the western aspect because, remember, there's some weird magical reason that the Roman Empire decides to move to the east later on, okay? I know. And nobody bats an eye at that. Everybody's just like, oh yeah, totally makes sense, bro. You just pack up and... Okay, we'll get to that. I'll make fun of that in a second. So this is the quote-unquote original Roman Empire. And they say that this Roman Empire was established by Augustus. This first Roman Empire essentially dominates all of the Mediterranean, Europe, North Africa, and some parts of the Near East. So essentially, this empire exists for almost exactly 500 years, right? 27 BC to 476 AD, right? That's not a bad number, almost perfectly half a millennia. Very convenient for chronologists, by the way. Anyway, so eventually it will fall in 476. All right. So once it dies in 476, apparently nothing happens between 476 and 800 AD. And this is quite literally what mainstream believes. They honestly believe that once the first Roman Empire falls, literally nothing happens. There is this magical dark age that surrounds the entire area, and everybody just suddenly, for some weird reason, in 476 AD, just stops doing things. And this is quite literally what they say, because there's no evidence for anything that happens between 476 AD and 800 AD. Now, I know you can kind of be a smartass and try to pick a couple little things here and there, but essentially, like as far as any kind of real scientific evidence goes, any kind of real archaeological evidence goes, with respect to how the mainstream looks at things, they are forced to say that nothing happens between 476 and 800 AD. One of the reasons why is because of the written sources that they will eventually use to back up all of the claims for all of these various Roman empires. Okay, before we go further, I'm just going to talk crap between each one of these little empires. It's fascinating that historians are willing to say that an empire lasted for half a millennia. If we look around nowadays, if we look at modern countries and modern kingdoms or whatever you want to call stuff that's going on right now, nobody has really existed for 500 plus years. Now, I know you can kind of try to make a few tweaks and excuses for certain governments and stuff like that, but if we're honest, there is no real empire that has lasted for half a millennium. And the reason why is simple, right? It takes a lot to keep something going. And if there's one thing that we have now learned in today's day and age scientifically, is that people change, right? The times change. And as these changes happen, so do leaders, so do borders, so do economies. Everything starts to shift. I have a hard time believing that an empire back in the day lasted for 500 years in the sense that it was a cohesive empire. Now, there will probably be better historians that will come in and say, well, I mean, we call it an empire, but, it was kind of loose here and there and stuff like that. And that's fine. I'll give you that. Fair enough. At least those historians are being a little more honest. But we just take these huge, long reigning empires for granted, right? We just, like Egypt, 5,000 year empire and all of this stuff. It's like, what are you talking about? There's probably never been a single human empire or group or organization that has lasted longer than a few hundred years. I mean, right now, for example, there's not a single example I can look at right now on planet Earth that I could call a continuous, empire or country or whatever from when we consider it began. I mean, every single one that exists nowadays is completely different from what it originally was. It might still carry the name, maybe, but at the end of the day, I would say scientifically, it's different. So, for example, the Americas of today are completely different. Sorry, the United States, let me say that. The United States of America is a completely different country from what it was, let's say, in 1908. And I mean completely, unrecognizably completely. They're not the same country. They're only the same country in name. In everything else, it's different. And I would not be surprised, actually, to see the United States of America break apart to some degree here within the next century or so. I could see that happening. And I don't mean in some kind of crazy revolution or war or something, although that could happen. I just mean just as a natural flow of how things operate. Basically, things change, and when things change, so do quote-unquote empires. Anyway, just something to think about. I know, I'm just rambling. All right, so their empire falls, and then there is this magical dark age between 476 and 800 AD, okay? So apparently everybody stops moving, everybody stops thinking, everybody stops farming, everybody stops writing, everybody stops inventing, everybody stops traveling, everybody stops everything. And then magically, in 800 AD, the Holy Roman Empire emerges out of nowhere. So the Holy Roman Empire is formed essentially in what we would consider the early medieval period. And this empire was established when Charlemagne was crowned emperor by the Pope in, 800 AD basically. Now, this empire is claimed to continue the legacy of the Roman Empire in Western Europe, although it was primarily Germanic and decentralized, right? That's the interesting thing about what we also tend to call, not we, I'm not going to take credit for that, what stupid mainstream historians tend to call the Holy Roman Empire or a Roman Empire, right? The Holy Roman Empire is now a completely different makeup than the original Roman Empire, right? Now we have primarily Germanic individuals now running this entire situation. This empire lasts, essentially, according to mainstream historians, for 1,000 years, essentially. It lasts all the way until Napoleon got rid of it in 1806. Yeah, how do you like that? So, I was already talking crap about a 500-year empire. No, now we have a 1,000-year cohesive empire to where everybody stayed together in lockstep and there were no changes whatsoever, right? It's garbage. It's stupid. It just doesn't make sense. Okay, anyway. Then the third Roman Empire that is supposed to be, or that is kind of considered existing in the mainstream, and we'll cover some other ones as well, because these are just the three main ones. There's two other ones I want to kind of talk about as well, or at least one more. Anyway, so the third Roman Empire is essentially Russia, believe it or not, right? So in the 15th century, following the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Moscow essentially claims that they will now inherit the mantle of Rome, and that's what they did. Right, that's why you have their rulers are called czars. Czars was just another name for Caesar. Right? And so, the linguistics gets interesting as well. Right, when you start to look, okay, we'll get into some of that. Okay, anyway, so Russian rulers eventually would just consider their state the Third Rome, and that's where you get the Third Roman Empire. And okay, that's the basics of what kind of mainstream says is going on with all of the Roman empires. Now, of course, I know there's a ton of little details in there that the mainstream has, and there's all kinds of events. For example, Rome will eventually shift its empire to Byzantium, which will later become Constantinople, and this occurred in the early 4th century AD. Right? So I just want to say that so that we understand that there is supposedly a lot of detailed stuff going on in certain aspects of these empires. But it's a weird thing, right? If we look at the move to Constantinople, right? Why does Rome even shift over there? The mainstream excuse, they'll say, well, you know, they wanted to shift over there because Constantine defeated all of his rivals and he became the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. So he wanted to go over to Byzantium because Byzantium was recognized as like the key area of all economics in the area and all that crap, right? And that sounds fantastic on paper. It does. It makes sense, right? Okay, yeah, you know, you're the ruler. You want to rule in an area that's number one. But it begs the question, what the hell happened to what was going on in Italy? Why isn't Italy number one, right? If the Roman Empire is so great, why is that existing area of Rome not just absolutely flourishing and dominating over the Byzantium area? It's a legitimate question. Nobody asks that question. And when you do ask the question, you'll start to hear stupid little things like, well, you know, barbarians kind of started showing up and they had to move and, you know, and that's where the historian will start to mumble and start to say, you're not allowed to question me. You just need to listen. It's in this book. Tacitus said so. I mean, that is what they're going to eventually tell you, right? And then, of course, at the end of the day, if you keep pushing, you are going to be a conspiracy theorist and they will, you know, they'll start ignoring you because at the end of the day, they do not have answers to a lot of the basic questions that arise when you look at the mainstream version of the Roman Empire. Okay, so let's get into some of the evidence that shows, well, let's break up these Roman empires. Let's get rid of them. That's what we have to do. Now, I'll be honest, there is a ton of evidence that really destroys all of the chronology with respect to how mainstream looks at the Roman empires. We're going to go over some of the evidence that most people are actually never really exposed to, especially if you continue to live in the mainstream and, you know, anyway. All right, so let's do this. So there's been a lot of fantastic academic scholars out there who have done all kinds of amazing work with respect to destroying the mainstream versions of Rome. And you can argue that it started with Isaac Newton. I mean, Isaac Newton was one of those people who was right there questioning all of this kind of stuff, right? And that's always completely ignored. Everybody loves to talk about Newtonian physics, but nobody wants to mention the brilliant work that dude did relative to chronology. And of course, the reason why they don't do that is because if you start doing that, then all of the cracks start to be shown with respect to the mainstream story. And we can't have that, can we? All right, so let's do this. I'm going to start with some work from Fomenko. Anatoly Fomenko and G.B. Nozovsky and all kinds of, and their team, I guess I'll say, they have done some absolutely crazy work that has gone a great distance to scientifically prove that not only is the chronology of the Roman empires completely wrong. Now, the first problem that we have to acknowledge, and that even mainstream historians, they do acknowledge it, they just ignore it, is the fact that there are these weird dark ages that exist between the various time frames. Now, I've gone over this before, but we now know for a scientific fact that there are no such thing as these dark ages. Right? Humans did not magically stop doing things for several hundred years and then pick right back up where they left off, 100 or 200 years later. That did not happen. So one of the things that we have to understand is that there's no such thing as dark ages. So if we remove the dark ages, then all of a sudden the chronology, well, a couple of things happens, right? The first thing that happens is that suddenly the Roman chronology shortens because now we're subtracting, between 400, 700, or 800 years out of the first and, upwards of, mainly the first millennium. Now, that sounds crazy at first, but what do you want from me? The science proves what it proves. And we'll go over a little bit of that here in a second. But I've done other shows that have gone over the Dark Ages and how they never existed and the science that proves that they never existed. So I won't belabor the Dark Age point here, but just know that the Dark Ages, they don't exist, okay? And that was scientifically proven a long time ago. Okay, so we get rid of those. already the chronology has to change, right? So already, if you're missing almost a millennium of time, whatever you have calibrated based off of Roman chronology is going to be completely wrong. I mean, it's just done. There's no way around this. The next thing that we have to look at when we look at Roman chronology is that for some weird reason, when we start to really pay attention to the events in Roman chronology and to the historical figures in Roman chronology, we start to notice a lot of similarities shared by the First and Second Empire. And by similarities, I mean almost identical events or identical historical figures doing the exact same stuff across both empires. Stuff like this starts to become more apparent. One of the things that Anatoly Fomenko and G.V. Nazovsky have done is they actually went through all of the empires and they went through all of the historical figures and they mapped out all of the similarities between all of the historical figures between the two different Roman empires. So what you see on the screen now is that similarity. On the left, you have the First Roman Empire, and you have a bunch of names and dates associated from the mainstream, I might add. This is all mainstream dating. On the left, you have the First Roman Empire, and on the right, you find the Second Roman Empire. And as you look down these charts, what immediately becomes apparent is that for some weird reason, rulers all seem to rule in mirror images of each other across both Roman empires. The next thing you start to notice is not only do you see the dates lining up in a mirror image, they're just 300 years apart, is that you also will find names that start to look duplicated. Now this gets weird because, it's one thing to have somebody named after somebody, maybe here and there you have a couple of people sort of named the same thing, but when you start to look at all of the names and all of the empires, you start to see that it almost looks like people copied and pasted from the latest Roman Empire and then duplicated and triplicated all of these names and events and threw them into the past to create other empires. Now, this is an inescapable data point. When we start to look at the names and we start to look at events, we find this happening all over the place with respect to the two Roman empires. Now, right now, the next question would be, all right, well, it's there. Like, this is a fact. This is a mainstream historical fact. You can go and corroborate this on your own, right? Anatoly Fomenko has done it for us, but feel free to go double check him. The names all line up, and a lot of the deeds of the people who have been duplicated and triplicated also line up. This is inescapable. So, for example, the First Roman Empire that allegedly exists, from early hundreds BC to the 3rd century AD, we find Lucius Sulla ruling around 82 to 78. Then in the Second Roman Empire, from 300 to 600 AD, we find another Lucius ruling. Interestingly enough, both of these guys seem to rule for exactly 5 years. The next ruler we find a ruler named Strife in the First Roman Empire. He rules for 1 year. Then we look over to his contemporary in the Second Roman Empire, also named Strife, who rules for 1 year. This goes on and on and on. It's insane. Like, it literally just looks like somebody took a potentially existing Roman Empire from some age, God knows where, right? And we'll get into that. But what they did is they grabbed those people and they just duplicated and triplicated them and threw them into the past. This is a problem, because we need to figure out why we are finding these exact historical mirror images with respect to Roman chronology. It gets even worse because all of these rulers that you see on your screen right now, we don't have any actual historical evidence for almost any of them. Literally almost no evidence for any of these guys existing. The existence of all of these rulers literally comes from manuscripts that were magically discovered during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. That's where all of these names come from. And don't forget, during the Renaissance, there was a huge industrialization of forgeries being made that were literally just creating history out of thin air for a couple of reasons, right? The first reason is that there was a demand to where people would purchase a manuscript that was from the ancient past. So, of course, there were quite literally industrial warehouses set up to where scribes were just pumping out all of these forgeries for no other reason other than to get money. Like, it's that simple. You don't need any kind of excuse. You don't need any kind of weird, convoluted explanation as to why this was going on. People were paying for a product, and they supplied the product, right? During the Renaissance, it was a fad. It was in fashion to have ancient pieces of history. And it wasn't just manuscripts, by the way. It was also actual artifacts. So while we did have, industrialization of manuscripts being pumped out, we also had all kinds of artistic forgeries, in the form of painting, sculptures, etc., and just in general random artifacts, right? So some sculptor would make a few pieces that looked like some part of a Roman temple, and they would sell it to some, baron or some guy who would pay a lot of money for it, and he would say, "Oh yeah, this is from ancient Rome in AD." But it's really old, bro. So here you go. And then the guy would be like, "Yeah, here's $100." This is how history is essentially created during the Renaissance period. And it's funny. This is the period where mainstream historians end up getting almost all of their information. Right? So right off the bat, at the very least, it is disingenuous for any kind of a historian to make a claim that we have any idea of what was going on back in 27 BC. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. We don't have any evidence for any of this, and we know that the evidence that we do have is more than likely a forgery, or just an outright lie. I mean, this is a problem. So if we're going to look at these empires and we start to see names being duplicated, we have to admit that there is probably no such thing as at least one of these empires, which means that you immediately, scientifically, have to remove at least another 300 years from the chronology. So right now, we have no choice but to scientifically remove about 1,000, if not a little more, years from Roman chronology, right? So what does that put us? Well, it's funny. That immediately says that we are not living in the year 2024 or 2025. We aren't living in that year, are we? Right? We are living in 1025. That would be the year we would be living in right now, or whenever you're listening to this. You get my point, right? It changes everything. It changes right now. It changes how we look and live in our society right now. It also, if all of this stuff is fake, it also means there is a lot of people in power right now that should not be in power, right? The donation of Constantine is a very interesting problem. And yeah, we'll talk about that maybe in just a little bit. So, first problem we have to deal with. Dark Ages don't exist. You get rid of those years. Second problem that we find. Mirror images and duplications and triplications of names and events. You know what? It's funny. There's no way that I'm going to be able to get through all of the evidence that disproves Roman chronology. In fact, I'm already doing Fomenko's discoveries a great disservice by just kind of showing you guys a little snippet. I can't recommend enough going and reading these books. They're freely available online, by the way. You can go get them at Internet Archive. They're there, so you don't even have to pay for it. You can go and you can check his work against your own if you would like, all right? But in the interest of time, I won't belabor the point because I do want to go over one other aspect that completely destroys Roman chronology before we close this down. The reality is the more I learn about chronology, the more I realize there is so much scientific evidence that just outright disproves the mainstream's current chronology with respect to how they understand Rome. I mean, it's insane. I mean, the fact that anybody believes any of this at all is just, it's mind-numbing. It's frustrating, and it's just stupid because there is no scientific evidence to support. Okay, all right. Okay, so there's one other huge piece of evidence that was discovered, and it should have been pointed out by archaeologists all over this planet from day one, by the way. And that evidence is quite literally archaeology. And more specifically, it's the stratigraphy related to the archaeology. Now, the information that I am about to present to you guys was created by a professor named Gunnar Heinsohn. He unfortunately passed away a little while ago, but this dude did some unbelievably amazing work when it came to simply looking at the evidence for a situation like Roman chronology. He looked at all kinds of other stuff as well, but he looked at Roman chronology and he was able to scientifically point out and prove that the archaeological evidence that the mainstream right now uses to support their claim about Roman chronology is completely wrong. And not only is it wrong, but it's absolutely insane, and it's inaccurate, and ultimately it's invalid. The conclusions that the mainstream comes to right now with respect to Roman chronology is absolutely insane, considering the kind of evidence that they themselves have discovered. So what we are going to look at now is the stratigraphy of Roman archaeology. Because what Gunnar Heinsohn discovered was that we do not have three separate layers representing three separate Roman empires. If you are not familiar with what stratigraphy is, essentially what stratigraphy is geological layers. So you guys have all seen it before. You see an archaeologist, they start to dig down, and once they hit certain layers, they say, yes, I've dug down 10 feet, so that means 1,000 years of time has passed since all of this dirt miraculously appeared on top of this site. And of course, so anyway, stratigraphy is all of those layers that geologists or archaeologists will dig into, and of course, archaeologists have now set up a situation to where every single layer that they dig down into now has a corresponding historical timeline and date associated with it. So if an archaeologist digs down 20 feet over there somewhere in Italy, he immediately is required to date whatever artifact he pulls out of 20 feet out of the ground to, say, the Second Roman Empire. And he can't do anything else with it. This is what mainstream archaeology has created. They've created a situation to where even if you are an honest archaeologist and you go and you start doing digs and you start making discoveries, you are required to follow the mainstream version of the dating system relative to the stratigraphical dating system that the mainstream uses. Yeah, how do you like that? I know I totally butchered that. Essentially, what you can look at is there's a chart of the stratigraphy, and all of those layers have a date associated with it. So if you're an archaeologist and you find something, 20 layers down, you are going to look at that chart, and that chart is then going to tell you where you need and are required to date that object. Essentially, what mainstream archaeologists have done is they have ensured that no new discoveries can shake the current paradigm relative to Roman chronology. How do you like that? Everything has already been pre-set up. So if you're somebody who is actually looking to make any kind of a new discovery, and hell, let's just say you actually made a new discovery, you are literally not allowed to actually have made a new discovery. Whatever you find, in whatever layer you find it in, already has a pre-established date. That's mind-numbingly insane. And every single archaeologist knows about this. And every single archaeologist, if they were being academically honest, should have immediately called this out as insanity, thrown that garbage away, and hunted down and slaughtered any other archaeologist that was trying to defend some kind of a system like this. Because objectively speaking, scientifically speaking, this is stupid, right? The whole concept of already predating all of stratigraphy is absolutely asinine. There is no scientific basis in doing that. This concept of having predated stratigraphy is nothing less than a mainstream academic fantasy designed to ensure that the chronology never changes. Now, that's a problem from a scientific perspective, because the reality is, in science, we don't care what the answer is, just as long as we are getting the answer. And we know for a fact you cannot predate stratigraphy like that. That's not how that works. Really quick, by the way, let me just go over why stratigraphy is stupid anyways, or using stratigraphy to date the way they date is unbelievably dumb. Here's the basics of it. From the beginning, none of these archaeologists even ask the question, why do we find dozens, if not in some cases, hundreds of feet of sediment above supposedly only a couple of 1,000-year-old ruins? Where the hell did all of these layers come from? That's a legitimate question, and that's a question that you will never hear them ask. They just take it for granted. Oh yeah, 2,000 years passed? Yeah, 100 feet of sediment easily could have built up all over Italy. No problem, bro. It's just not an issue. I mean, that's just how geology works. Yeah, shut up, dude. That's not... The point of view is insane. What these archaeologists have to have you believe, and of course the masses believe it, is that literally inches of dirt are appearing every single year and nobody does anything about it. There is no erosion taking place, and the dirt just continuously builds up and buries all of these ruins, so that archaeologists can find and date them at a later date. Like this, the whole concept is ridiculous. The fact that we find ruins buried under all of this sediment is a huge problem in and of itself, by the way. And it's beyond the scope of this show right now, but it's just something to think about. Where the hell did all of that debris come from? Why are we finding all of these ruins, which are only maybe 1,000 to maybe 2,000 years old, literally buried and covered in dirt, mud, and debris? Like, what the hell happened? Anyway, so we find a situation to where we do have all of these ruins under all of this sediment, which of course has built up a stratigraphy. Okay, great. When archaeologists started to dig and they started finding all kinds of ruins and artifacts, etc., what started to have to happen was that all of these ruins and artifacts needed to be correlated to some kind of a date. Now, the story of the ancient Roman times, of course, comes out of all of those books that were magically found during the Renaissance period. So what happened is that archaeologists found themselves in a weird situation, mainstream archaeologists. They were starting to find things that didn't line up scientifically with really anything the way they had been taught, but they had no other way of placing these artifacts in a chronology other than referencing all of those magical books that came out of the Renaissance period. They just didn't have anything else. Now, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting that we do not have any good, reliable chronology until the Middle Ages? First of all, that's crazy. And then second of all, the only place we get a chronology is out of a very small area from a place that we know was producing forgeries. I mean, you would think that people would, maybe raise an eyebrow or two once you start doing that. Anyway, archaeologists were stuck in a corner because they had nowhere to place all of these artifacts. So what happened was they looked at those books and they were like, all right, fine. Tacitus gives us all these dates and stuff like that, and other authors go off of him and blah, blah, blah. And it snowballed into creating what we now have as a chronology. So archaeologists had no other chronology to latch onto, so they latched onto that. And since that has been going on for over, a century plus, now we are where we are now. And unfortunately, Archaeologists, they don't question the chronology anymore because it's been around for so long. It's just set in stone in their world. So they don't know to question it. They think it's real. So what they had to do then was they had to force fit all of their discoveries into the mainstream chronology, which then, of course, created a mainstream stratigraphical chronology, which then, of course, puts us into the situation that we're in right now. And essentially, nobody questions this, right? I mean, ask yourself, have you ever gone and actually audited Roman archaeologists? Have you ever stopped and gone and scientifically tested any of this? Have you done anything like that? Have you corroborated any of these discoveries against real scientific testable methods? And the answer is, of course, no. None of you have. Not a single person is out there testing anything against what these people are claiming. I don't do this anymore, but people just blindly believe whatever comes out of mainstream academia. And because that is the landscape we have now, we now have an illegitimate chronology. And pretty much everybody should have seen that, like right from the get-go. Okay, I know, I'm just complaining now. All right. So what Gunnar Heinsohn ended up doing and ended up noticing and ended up figuring out and then proving is that what he started to do is he asked a couple of very basic questions. Questions like, how can Rome have history from 1 to the 930s CE if it builds residential quarters, aqueducts, latrines, sewers, roads, ports, or even bakeries only from the 1st to the 230s CE? He also asked, for example, how can archaeologists from other cities or entire countries complain about some 700 years without settlement layers in the first millennium CE if such strata do not even exist in Rome? Those are two very good questions. And in fact, those two questions are like 10 shows in and of themselves. Anyways, what he's asking here and what he's pointing out is the obvious. So what happened is that archaeologists only ever find stuff for a Roman Empire, for one Roman Empire, in the layers dated from the 1 to 230s CE. They find everything there, right? They find sewers, latrines, residential quarters, aqueducts. They find what you would expect from a large city, right? You would expect to find all of these things. However, once you start digging above the layers of the 1 to 230 CE, you find nothing. Suddenly, there are no cities, there are no roads, there are no latrines, there are no new construction in the Roman empires for almost 700 years, according to the mainstream. So what the hell is going on here? This isn't what we're taught from the mainstream. The way the mainstream talks is that we have all these different empires and they all build cities and roads and they're all fantastic and there's all this rich history. But how can there be a rich history if there are no new constructions for 700 years? Essentially, what archaeologists are asking you to believe, and what everybody does believe, is that all of the Roman Empire situation was built within those 200-ish years. And then for the next 700 years, nobody builds anything new at all. They literally only live in the constructions from the early part of the first millennium. What sense does that make? That's one of the dumbest statements you can make, but that is quite literally what mainstream archaeologists believe. So if we look at some of Gunnar's slides here, he goes through and he points out, using science and using real evidence and using stratigraphy, all the problems with archaeologists and where they come up with their ridiculous chronology. From a scientific and archaeological perspective, there is no such thing as multiple Roman empires. The evidence, quite literally, does not exist. So if the evidence does not exist, if the scientific evidence does not exist to support what the mainstream currently says happened throughout that Roman Empire era. Why do they say it's there? What is going on? Why do we have institutions, academic institutions, which are scientifically wrong, spreading scientifically inaccurate lies? And that is exactly what is happening right now with respect to Roman chronology. So the stratigraphical evidence is not there to scientifically support the mainstream chronology. It's just not there. And don't forget, we want to base all of our conclusions off of scientific evidence. So right now, if you are using any kind of Roman chronology to calibrate any of your theories whatsoever, I'm not trying to be a dick, but the reality is your theory is now, it'll be thrown off. It has no choice. Maybe your theory is right, but chronologically speaking, if you are using anything from the mainstream with respect to ancient Rome, you've got to redo your stuff. Now, the beauty of this, of course, is once you are able to push all of this garbage to the side, if you can deprogram yourself to get rid of modern Roman chronology, you're going to find some unbelievably amazing discoveries pop out from this conclusion. Now, one of the first questions, obviously, that we can now ask is, all right, so wait a second. If all of these Roman empires never existed, what's the real story then? I mean, do we have a real story? And the answer is yes. And this is another 10 shows in and of itself, but I'll give you a quick little breakdown. So, at the beginning of this show, or the first piece of information I gave you in this show, is we pointed out that the first two Roman empires, and as well as the third, actually, I probably should have gone into that as well, we find a situation to where names of rulers and dates of events and time frames of events that happened, etc., we find a situation to where all of these events have been triplicated between three various empires. So it begs the question, all right, great. So that means at least two of those things never happened. They are phantom duplicates of maybe the original, and that's a possibility. What's fascinating about this whole subject is that Rome actually did exist. It just did not exist during the time that the mainstream says it existed. All of the stuff that we think about Roman nowadays, get rid of the first two empires. Just get rid of all of that crap. Erase all of it. Hell, even erase the Romulus and Remus part of it as well. Although there's probably some truth to that. But what we need to do then is we need to change the date. So where does the date go to? It's entirely possible that there was only one Rome that has ever existed, and that Rome that we know of existed in the early Middle Ages. Not in the BC era, not in the early first millennia, but only around 900 years ago. Essentially, eventually, what would happen is that Rome was the Rome of the Middle Ages. And then as people wanted more power, and as things started shifting, and as people, started making up stories for all kinds of reasons, what happened is that people needed material to vindicate their power grabs. So, for example, right, the donation of Constantine. I told you I'd talk about it. The donation of Constantine right now, relative to even mainstream thinking, they believe it's a forgery, right? Most academic scholars on both sides of the coin now believe that the donation of Constantine is an outright forgery. And if you go and you look at that history, you can see why you'd do a forgery and how that forgery would have come about. I've got another perspective for you. What if the donation of Constantine is real? And by that I mean, what if Constantine didn't live in the 400s AD, but instead lived in, say, the 1100s AD or the 1200s AD? What if he lived around then? Yeah, right? Constantine in the 11 or 1200s AD. Yeah, that's crazy. I know it's crazy, but if you delete all of the stupid Dark Ages, suddenly that's exactly where we would expect to find Constantine living. Now, let's take it one step further, simply following science and evidence. What if that document was actually written by Constantine and handed over to the Vatican? What makes more sense? That the Vatican sat on a document for like almost 1,000 years and did not use it to claim Rome until they finally did decide to use it, or that document was given to the Vatican right then and there in the 11 or 1200s, around then. I don't have an exact date. It gets weird. We'll talk about that later. But what if Constantine gave the Vatican that document at that date, and the Vatican took that, and then they predated the document 1,000 years earlier to try to make it sound like the church had true and ultimate power from the beginning, so that when they would take over, illegally, I might add, they would have more claim to their power. This was a common situation going on all over the place during the Renaissance, all over Europe, all over North Egypt, everywhere. It was crazy. And that's why people were forging all of these documents. Well, that's one of the reasons, right? To gain power. And that's exactly what probably happened with the donation of Constantine. It's probably not a forgery. It's probably a real legit document given to the Vatican by Constantine. It's just we have the dates wrong because we are trusting the dates from the Vatican themselves. How do you like that? And don't forget, a lot of history is also dictated by the Vatican. I should say a lot of Roman history. Well, I guess you could also say a lot of history, but a lot of Roman history is also simply dictated by books that the Vatican claims that they have. How trustworthy do you think that is? Roman chronology is wrong. There is no such thing as ancient Rome. Now, I get it. If you are classically trained, everything I just sound is going to sound crazy. But don't forget, everything I've just said is based on science. This isn't theory. This isn't, some schizo stuff. I did not just have a dream and then decided to go make a YouTube video about it. Like, this is legitimate science. This is legitimate geology, legitimate archaeology, legitimate history. We do not have a grasp on history the way we think we do. Even things like the Roman Empire, something that pretty much everybody believes that we completely understand, we don't have anything. In fact, the reason why we don't have anything is because it never existed. I mean, there's just nothing there, right? The Dark Ages, there's nothing there. There's no reason to believe in any of that crap. And that's what it is. It's just garbage. So we have to move on. We have to get rid of a lot of the chronology that we now currently inject into all of our studies. Now, if you're somebody who only deals with, say, really truly ancient stuff, like I said, it still matters because your chronology is still going to be based off and calibrated by Roman chronology, of course, which is also going to be based off and calibrated by Egyptian chronology. And of course, all of these chronologies we now know are scientifically wrong. Yes, Egyptian chronology is absolutely wrong, 100%. Okay, so if you're trying to give me a date for the pyramid and you're relying on mainstream chronology, you got to stop. I mean, there's nothing else I can tell you. The conversation has to end because you do not have the information. Okay, all right. So we have to get rid of Roman chronology. Now, once we get rid of Roman chronology, like I said, suddenly a lot of historical events start to add up, and the catastrophic events that our ancestors claim happened also start to line up chronologically. A little earlier on, I talked about a lot of these buildings being buried under layers of sediment. Why? Where did these layers come from? Well, if we just look at the science and we look at the history, what happens is that one last catastrophic event comes into focus. And this event took place about 1,000 years ago. Now, I do not have an exact date, but I am starting to call this event the Zero Event because one of the things that we find is that history as we now know it from the mainstream seems to begin right after this event takes place. And that makes sense, right? It makes sense that history would start after the last cataclysm because we have not had another cataclysm to help jumble everything up and destroy civilization. Right? We are in a period of a lot of peace and calmness relative to cosmological events. Right? because of that peace, we now have the history that we have. But anything that took place before these cataclysms is absolutely either destroyed, jumbled, and I have a good feeling, or not a good feeling, a bad feeling, that there are people on this planet who are well aware of these catastrophic events, and they have zero interest in you discovering the truth. So that is why Roman chronology will stay the way it stays. That's why these empires that never existed will continue to exist in the mainstream so that nobody can get closer to the truth. It's very simple divide and conquer. It is very simple distraction methodology, and ultimately it is just putting you into a disassociative state unbeknownst to yourself. Once you get in that state, you're easy to control. And look what's going on right now. Like I said earlier, nobody is questioning any of these empires. There's no reason to believe they exist, but nobody questions them. And the only reason why is because you are not trained to question it, right? You are ostracized if you question. Okay, all right, I know. Now I'm just pissed. Okay. So anyway, we have to get rid of mainstream Rome. So now we're going to get rid of it. All right, it's gone. Now we are free to engage in real history.